Night Scorch session 5. Previously, we covered essentially a lot of JavaScript and how we went over like the basic principles of JavaScript as well as how it can be applied further on in your HTML and CSS. We looked at how JS essentially, at least the foundational level, we saw how it's somewhat similar to Python, where you're able to compute various functions and whatnot to your code. And then we looked at how it was integrated with HTML and CSS and how we were able to manipulate and change certain aspects of the code without directly modifying it in the HTML and CSS component. So in today's session, we'll be looking at the different parts of a site, the ways of developing a site, let's say static site generator and SSG, basics of the Markdown and YAML, markup transformations, template languages, building a site with static site generator, and Hugo. Of course, it seems like there's a lot of content we'll be covering, but we'll make sure that you guys understand the general idea of each of these concepts. Once again, if you want to find these slides and the files associated, you can find them on the Schulich Ignite website and on the Schulich Ignite GitHub, as shown on the links here. Currently, we are at the point where we can build websites, and to get better, we can do it with more JavaScript practice to do more ambitious and more unique designs to it, such as creating games out of it, and making graphics, adding search parameters and whatnot, etc. We've also looked at the CSS and how you could practice that even more. So then you can implement various animations, you can implement various transitions, etc. And we've seen that you can practice how to make the design of your website and see how you want to implement various components to it. However, we do still have some issues in this regard. First one being the usability. Because although we can create the sites, what we really want to do is see if we want others to be able to work with our designs, and how can we force people and developers to do that, as well as looking at the scale. Sites like Google don't store every possible search result on your machine, so how do those type of sites work? And this is where we get into the different parts of a site. So the front end is essentially what we've been doing so far. The front end is essentially what the person or the user will see on their web page. So that basically involves the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. All of this can run on the device, except you can see that it can become more complicated. And in such conditions could be such as trying to find a user account within a batch of users. You could do this with JavaScript, however, it would be too slow to do on people's devices. And on top of that, it wouldn't be active, rather, it would be you need to find a way to ensure that you can find the data whenever you want and whenever you can. And that's where the backend component comes in. So the backend is essentially considered the server side, whereas the front end we say is the client side. So again, front end is everything the user will see visually. The back end is where all like the quote unquote magic kind of happens, where you essentially have the information and data held, and that's where you can access said information and data. Most of them run on a certain host, and then they make the sites work, which are called the backend. So you have your databases, your networking, all of those. Again, we'll see later on how those kind of concepts are incorporated within websites. Google is one uh, standard example where it incorporates both front end and back end. Front end is essentially what you're seeing on the Google page, whereas the back end is where Google is actually trying to receive the information and data based on your search result. And again, we're looking at back-end, front-end interaction. So some systems can become complicated because of all the data processing on the back end, and as well as trying to display the information on the front end. But at this point, what we can say is by the time it's on the client's browser and everything's visible, all of the backend components would have functioned. So if you consider like anything that takes loading of gathering information and whatnot, you can see, such as on Google, you might search up something. Maybe it'll take time to search and return a result, and maybe sometimes it doesn't. There's been cases where if you try searching something really specific, it's probably not in its database, and it's not as generic enough for it to understand, and then it just doesn't return a result. So essentially, that's like the interaction between your front end and back end. Again, backend is going to help with storing files and information that the user wants to see, and then the front end is just allowing for that seeing component. And so the ways of developing a site, there are different categories of sites, as not every type of site is going to be the same. Uh, Again, we don't really need to worry about the whole database, or at least not like super fancy or anything. We just need to make a website that can show up for people. And so if you imagine, such as an online news company, you'll need a site where people can log in, create content, and have it show up. You have social media where, again, it's not just a simple place of website, but like you have your username, you have stuff that you upload that allows other people to see the content and whatnot. So that basically deals with the front end and back end components working with one another. The first one we'll be looking at is a static site. So the static sites are the one where the backend only does the bare minimum. The primary content is going to be in the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. And so all the backend has to do is just send those files to the client. And this type of stuff is what we built so far, because the backend in this regard is done automatically, where right now other users might not be able to see what you have done, but if you start hosting a website, then that's where the backends just simply send those files to the client. And again, these ones tend to be cheapest to make and easiest to set up. Looking at the dynamic web apps CMS sites, these ones are more than just serving a web page that relies on just the front end. This also has some back end that has some usability and some purpose. So a backend could be handling for user accounts, for databases, and etc. For it to be a dynamic site, it just needs to be set up to do more than just serving the site files. Rather, it should serve some purpose. If you're trying to do some searching, it returns a result. If you search up another component, it returns a different type of result. And again, there's two different types of dynamic sites we can look at. Some apps will be called one, two, or the other. Some apps have aspects of both, much like front end and back end. It's just a shorthand. So looking at the CMS, content management systems, this is a name essentially given to basically normal websites where they have a backend that allows the users to create content. And so you can see where essentially making these like animations here where you're creating content, saving stuff. This is generally what the content management system is. And we can see here, this one here in this case is WordPress, and it's a popular CMS. This is Drupal, and it's another popular CMS. Web apps, this is just a name given to systems that do more than just do something more complicated than just generating content, as it generally involves showing more information and I guess data than it would on a standard web page. So in this animation, you can see here how it's presenting various information and data, which you wouldn't find on like a typical or average website. So, quick question. Imagine you work at a news company, the site lets you log in, create an article, submit it to be reviewed, and it's approved. You'll see it show up. Which of these parts of the process are the front end and which is the back end? I believe you can answer in the chat if you can. I'll give about 2 minutes for this question. So essentially, the main part is the front end is going to be where you can log in. You can then create an article, and when you submit it, by submitting, you essentially send it towards the back end, the database, and then it's going to be reviewed. And then once it's been reviewed and approved, it'll be sent back to the front end, which will then show up essentially. Looking at the static site generators, the SSGs, this is somewhere right in the middle where if you want to have modified content without knowing the HTML and you don't want to pay to host your own server, the static site generators do exactly what it sounds like. They take in the data and then they generate a static site for you. And since the output static sites, you can allow users to work with the easy to handle type of data and then return a static site generator to create a website from that type of data. So as you can see from the animation here, there's an example of what the static site generator looks like. And when you can use each, so essentially here's like a standard table which allows you to understand a bit more simpler how you want to use or how you want to create a website. So when you look at the static sites, usually user technical ability is going to be advanced, project timeline for it's going to be short, and the budget small, number of users, maintenance frequency charges. Again, you can see on this table uh, how often or what type of data is relevant for each of these types of websites, and it'll give you an idea of how you want to create your own website. Here are some other resources that you can check here and more links that talk about the front end, back end, and a combination of both. You can check these links out to see more information about these or how to incorporate these type of website designs. Again, what were the main things that are differentiated between the static, dynamic, and static site generated based sites? You could just look at the table again and see the type of information that's primarily focused on it, where you can see the difference between how many users are required, how often changes are made, and whatnot. Markup languages. So markup languages like HTML are languages that allow you to define what you see and what gets displayed. So they don't do any type of processing. What they are done is they're fed into a parser to render the content like a browser in HTML. So then there's HTML, XML, Markdown, restructured, etc. Are all markup languages, and even Microsoft Word documents you can write will use markup languages in the backend to define what shows up. So you can see here you have a markdown shown with hashtag hello world. With HTML, it would be header one, hello world header one. And with the ODF, it essentially shows a different type of format similar to HTML, but you can see they're using styles as header. The text is type of P text, and then they mention style, name, header, and so forth. So all of these are going to be similar to one another. So the basics of Markdown and YAML. Markdown is a type of markup language that's quite simple to use and is designed to be human readable. It's written in plain text files like HTML and has any of the following extensions as shown over here. Primarily though, you see .md because it's the shortest. And you can write down Markdown in VS Code, and you can use a dedicated editor as well, like MarkText, or just a normal text editor. All of it will allow you to create your Markdown file. So Markdown preview in VS Code. Since we've been working with VS Code, the images here are going to show how it looks like in VS Code. So to use a Markdown in VS Code and to preview it, you want to open a markup or Markdown, my mistake, document, using Control Shift P. Then you can type down Markdown, and then from there select the Markdown option and open preview to the side. And when you do open preview to the side, it will show over here what the type of information is displayed. So you can see here by creating this markdown file they have right here, they were able to then preview what it looks like over here. Essentially, this type of content is going to be very useful for when you want to try to display information to a user that's new to your code specifically, since whenever you check somebody's code, Usually it's going to be kind of difficult to understand it all on your own from the very start. So occasionally these markdown files are really useful in describing out the general content of a code source, essentially. And it just explains to you the rundown of how a program's supposed to work. So then here we have some basics. So Markdown has a lot of tags similar to HTML, except without attributes. And Markdown will also often allow you to put HTML in it if you need to. So if you want to do the H1 tags, they look like this in Markdown with one hashtag hello world. Or even more complicated tags can become simpler, such as the ULs, unlorted list. So then you have a shopping list, and then you have eggs, ham, and spam. Simply written out, don't need any fancy tags and all the other extra components that are in HTML. And once again, these help with like displaying information that usually another user would read. And here we have a basic syntax of what it should look like with this link down here, you can look at the full markdown guide of all the other type of syntax. In this case, we're looking at the unordered list. So in markdown, it's just your simple dash, first item, second item, third item, fourth item. Then we can see here we have HTML, which is essentially what we mentioned on unordered list. And you have the list tag and then each item and then the closing tag. And then the rendered output would be first item, second item, and so on. Both of these will result in this rendered output. However, Markdown is mainly just, again, information based, whereas HTML could be used for the towards the website and everything. Yeah. The fallback for this is that they allow you to do, or the Markdown systems allow you to do default to HTML. So if you don't know how to do something exactly in Markdown, or you need to do an embedded, etc., you can often use HTML inline. Like in this case, for example. We have my blog post with the header one tag as shown up here. Then we have some text defined in here and some more conditions applied. In this case, we're trying to bold some text here and as well as down here. Then we show an iframe of some particular type of information or HTML component, which is shown down here. If you install Markdown all in one, you can use the Control plus B with some text highlighted to bold and Control I to italicize it. So all it really does is just help you design your Markdown files a bit more easily, and it's just a bit more efficient. Looking at the transformation, you've seen that there's often the same tags across different markup languages. This means you can convert them oftentimes one to one. Which is very handy because Markdown is easier to write than HTML, and then you can use it to generate your HTML. So again, you have here this Markdown component. So you have the Markdown, then you have which goes into HTML, and then your ODF. And again, you can use markup to help you with this transformation, but I would also advise that if you do understand how to use the HTML and practice it, it's also good. But in cases where it is easier to convert something, you can use this markup transformation. So, quick question. Which HTML corresponds to this markdown? So we have hello world, we have this is a bit of text, we have a shopping list with some items, and then we have an iframe mentioned down here.
Top hat. Go in top hat. We don't really expect you guys to memorize like all the syntax and stuff, but the answer here is C. But you can obviously in A, there's like a syntax error with the red. And for the difference between C and D is that iframe is actually its own thing in HTML. So um, the difference between B and C is that C uses an unordered list, which is the same as the thing they use in Markdown.
Yeah, there's also the thing where you can see where they're using the tag TR here, which in itself stands for table row, and here, which is EM, which and can also be I, which stands for italicized, which you can see right over here with the text, as we saw previously. So again, with B and D, you can see that both are using the table row tag, which isn't supposed to be used, rather should be the EM tag. And then again, there's a difference between the ordered lists and the iframe component here as well. Looking at YAML, it's a simple system that's mainly used for configuration. It uses key value pairs like JSON objects and Python dictionaries, or even hash maps. And it uses indentation like Python to indicate nesting. You can use the .yml or .yaml for these for the files, but the .yml is more common since we typically go with the shorter abbreviation for the extension of the files. And for example, you could look at this content of a configuration file in YAML. So they have name, they have age, shopping list, websites, portfolio, and then another component down here under the websites category. So again, we can see here the basics and the syntax. So in YAML, you will always have a key with a value in this form. So you'll have a key and a value. The value itself can be any valid data type. So it can be a string, an integer, a float, bool, object, etc. And you just have to keep in mind that there are multiple ways to represent the same types of data. So we have here, for example, we have a shopping list, which went with the conventional markdown style with the eggs, ham, and spam shown with the dashes. However, we can also represent it in the standard uh, form as well with the array with shopping list, eggs, ham, and spam. Name, you can see that there's three ways of defining name. So you could have just simple text, which will automatically be defined as string. We could do the double quotations and single quotation as well for the name. And then here we're looking at an type of object. So with these two, they essentially were similar for the most. They were similar for the most part. In this case, again, they are similar, except like some coloring and whatnot might be slightly different. But again, they still treat the same way. So we have websites here. The first website was going to be a portfolio, which is an object. And within the portfolio object, we have a URL and a host. And so, should any more websites be created and more objects be created, they'll have the same information of URL and host as well. So, in this case, we have portfolio, then we have the colon, then we have URL and host mentioned here. But then down here, we have a similar situation as well. We have websites. And again, they're separated by the indentation to indicate the various segments of the code. And if you want to find more resources on here, you can click on the links on the slides over here that indicate more about the YAML and the content behind it. So, quick question with the YAML basics. Which option describes the data correctly? So, what we have here is the institution, MIT. We have the title, MSc Computer Science, the year started, 2023, current, true, publications, a very important paper, date, description. So, which one of these options describes the data correctly? If you want to write in chat, you can. I'll give 2 minutes for this question. Unless this was supposed to be a top hat question, which I'm not sure. The general data here, you have your institution
Oh, it is supposed to
MIT.
be a top hat question.
Is there? There's no answers. That's why.
Oh, it's just super long. Hold on. Uh, okay, yeah, just explain it. It's like so long.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just explain it then. Again, so looking at the information, we have institution MIT. We have the title. We have the year started. So all of these values in itself are correctly described. Current is true. So again, this just describes the status, if you're still currently enrolled or if you're still dealing with the object or not. And then with publications, down here, then we have a very important paper. This very important paper is now an object of publications. And within this object, we have a date and description. So should any more objects of this type be created, they're going to have the same information of data and description as well, as it will ensure that each object made within the publications is going to be the same throughout. And it usually helps with dealing with the information properly when you want to display it on, say, a website of some sort. So looking at the Markdown front matter, uh, Markdown also supports adding in metadata to the files so long as it's between the two sets of the three dashes as shown over here and here. And this metadata is called the front matter and is in YAML as well. So this basically provides the general information about a markdown file, such as the title, the author, any tags that are related to it, and as well as the status of the publication. Code generation is essentially a technique that exists everywhere. It's the idea that source code is just really text, and because of that, we can code to write other code. So in this example, what we can see is that we have a name, age, and we have an HTML component shown here. So we're just formatting up the string as with H1, we have the name, then we have the P tag. This person is age years old. And essentially this just provides this output. And if we took this code, the output, the HTML variable to a file, we could have a web page. So this would work as a web page on its own. And again, it's just to show that this type of text is, or this type of code is just text. So there are other code generation examples. So there's Emmet, a snipping system we've been using. There's the formatting tools such as Flake 8 or Prettier. Online web builders such as Squarespace. You've probably heard of this like all over the internet. And no code platforms like Scratch, which generates Squeak code. So again, if you've ever used Scratch, this essentially is also the building blocks for code, and it's just already predefined code segments without having to actually write out every single component. So looking at the templating languages, they allow you to do code generation really efficiently. And in web development templating languages, they allow you to create HTML files that are processed and generated into another language. For example, you can use variables and return functions from Python as your values in HTML and JS. So you might have some Python conditions set up elsewhere, and you can return the value into your HTML and JavaScript component. Looking Ninja Basics, it's a very popular templating language, and essentially it works with a bunch of languages such as Java, Ruby, etc. And most importantly, Python. It works by having an environment which loads the templates through a loader, and then the template renders them. And then if you want to find more documentation, you can click on the link here. So looking at the basics usage in a Python file, what you can first do is import the packages. Uh, okay. Looking at the basic usage in a Python file, to start using Ninja, there are four steps in Python. You first import the package, you set up your environment, then you load a template, and then you can render the template with the data. But before you do all of this, first you need to install Ninja 2 using the pip install Ninja 2. If you're on Windows, and if you're on Mac or Linux, you would use this command down here, sudo pip3 install Jinja 2. So looking at this, essentially what we have is taking our example from earlier. This is what it would look like using Ninja. So again, you can see there's a lot of content shown over here, except this is all written in Python. This component here is just pure HTML. So we have again H1 Kieran, H1, the tags, and then you have your P tag saying you were 23 years old. And in this case here, because this was made in Python, you first do your import, then you set up the environment, then you can load up a template. And then the template is up to you on what kind of content you want to describe. And when you want to then render the template, then you can pass in the various arguments that you need to. So you have like name is set, your age is set, and then you can print the result. So this essentially just uses the Ninja, the Python component, and then essentially provides an HTML output. Now, if we try moving our templates to some files and load them from there, we could do this by adding a file system loader to the environment, and then we can change steps 2 and 3 from the previous one. So over here we have import, then we have to set up the environment again. And again, we've slightly modified this environment from this condition to now this condition. We added a loader. Then we can load the template. And then once we get the template, then we can then render the said template with the results, and then we can print out the HTML. So what it will do is that you must run this from the folder, otherwise it won't be able to find the template that you're looking for. And so essentially, instead of having written out a template, you're essentially going to just load a template, and your template's going to be pre-made already, and then you can, again, with step 4 mentioned here, just render it and then print out your HTML. So again, this is really showing the interaction between now Python and now HTML. So looking at basic usage of with templates continued, we have here a similar condition. Now we're looking at HTML again. First, we can add our template files to or if we can add our files to the templates directory and call it an index.ninja. And then we set our file system loader to look in the templates, which is why we need to put it in there. So this segment in itself is going to be the Ninja part, which is then called over here. And then some parameters are passed to it to then print out the results as shown over here. So essentially, this is like the raw way of providing the code. This is all in one file. This is basically working across 2 files with the general Python code mentioned here, and then the Ninja component mentioned here. Looking at the variables, Ninja can take an object, strings, integers, and essentially any other type of data that you want to throw at it. And you can access the variables in template by using the variable name with 2 squiggly braces on either end. So you have 2 squiggly here, 2 squiggly here, and your variable that you're looking for. In the above example, so long as there are variables called name and age, Ninja doesn't care what type they are. So you have to make sure that they are correct. So we haven't defined anything here for name and age, nor was it over here previously mentioned. However, here we've explicitly mentioned the type that we're sending by making sure Kieran here is a string and age here is an int type. So again, it's up to you on how you want to display that information and how you're going to be using it across your files. Looking at the fancy variables, so now we're dealing with some more components here. For more complicated data types, such as dictionary objects, etc., there's few ways to access their attributes. So we have here a hello and then config name from the dictionary component. And then here we have the year is, date, and then year, which is an object. So then we can look at here, we have config is set to with name and it says to Kieran, that's the dictionary component there. And then with the HTML component here, we have you then render out the uh, the template mentioned up here. So in this case, they have the date set to as datetime.now, which is your built-in Python component, which immediately gathers like all the information needed, the day, what week it is, and the year and whatnot. And then that's how you can access the object here, dot year. Looking at the functions and filters, Juninja can also run functions, what they call filters. There are a ton of built-in filters that you can use and can write your own. And again, they're used to help pass a variable on one side, followed by the uh, I guess vertical slash on your filter. So what it does is, for example, the capitalized filter, which capitalizes a string and can be used like this. So you have name and then capitalized right here. So again, that's your filter component, which helps with the additional condition for Janinja. Looking at the functions filter continued, you can see that one other important filter is safe. As we've seen in the last session, it's dangerous to let your HTML go unescaped. So Janinja escapes by default. If you want Janinja to recognize your code as code, you need to add a safe filter. So what this case will do is it will be just a string that is escaped, whereas this one is going to make sure it's secured and will be unescaped. Looking at the loops in Ninja, it's slightly different compared to Python. However, not by much. Instead of using squiggly braces, you can add a percent and then run a loop. This is useful when you're trying to iterate over lists and objects, whatever you're really iterating over. So what we have here is an unordered list. Then we have the percent sign, a percent sign here with the squiggly braces, and again here percent sign with end 4. And inside of it, we give the list and then item and then list. So instead of like having to manually present every single item, you can just use this for loop and then it'll present all the items at once. And then you must end your for loops with the end for as shown down here. Looking at the loop variables, Ninja has a special set of variables in the loops, including loop.first, loop.index, and loop.index0. So the first one is a Boolean that is true if on first iteration. Then you have the index, so current index starting from 1, and then the other one is just current index starting from 0. And it can be used like regular variables while iterating. So these are going to be very useful for certain type of loop conditions that you're looking for. And so again, it depends on how you want to implement it. There are conditionals. So if there, we looked at the for loops, now we're looking at the if statements. So you can also use the conditionals with the same format as loops with the percent symbols with the squiggly braces. And then again, you can just see what it looks like here. So you have if age is greater than or equal to 23, it's based, else it's less based. And then there's your end if again. And again, you must end with an end if, just as like the other one mentioned, you have to end with an end for. When you're setting the variables, it can often be useful to set up a variable in a template. So as you can see here, we have set name equals to Kieran, and we have set age equals to 23. And then we have hello name, and then your age years old. So this is different from how we mentioned a bit earlier on. Mentioned about here, where we're passing in some parameters to the template, whereas in this condition, we have the information already set inside of the template, and then it'll print out the same result. And again, you would set up variables in here that are going to deal with components with inside this loop, and then again, you want to send in parameters which are going to be dealt with conditions. So the first exercise we can try looking at here is looking at the files mentioned here. You can add in a support for a 3-column layout for each of the team members from a member dictionary. And then you have your export .py commands mentioned down here. And then you can look at the index.html component. I'll give about 10 minutes for this exercise.
Maybe a bit longer. Hold on.
20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do 20 minutes.